This is disc number 2.
"I don't understand," said little Scallop. "How could a waterfall be missing?" "The earthquake," said James. "It must have shifted the stream that fed the waterfall." Shining Pearl frowned at the lagoon. "That must be what caused the blood tide," she said. "There's no fresh water coming into the lagoon." "If that's true," said Teacher, "the mermaids, all of us, are doomed." "No," said Shining Pearl. "Maybe my father can fix it, if I can just explain to him." "But how?" said James. "We're trapped out here, and your father's about to attack," said Thomas. "I've got to get ashore somehow," said Shining Pearl. "Teacher, can you think of a way?" Teacher glanced at the shore, then the captured children, then the surrounding mermaid guards. "Perhaps," she said, "but it will be dangerous." "Tell us what to do," said Shining Pearl. The other children nodded. "All right," she said. "I'm about to talk with these mermaids in a way that will distract them. While I'm doing that, I want you to quietly untie each other's hands. Try not to move too much, and keep your hands behind you. Are you ready?" The children nodded. "Then do it. Now," said Teacher. She turned to the mermaids and quickly had their attention. While they stared at Teacher's eyes, the children worked each other free of their seaweed ropes. After a minute, Teacher turned back to them. "Are you ready?" she said. The children nodded. "Good. Now comes the difficult part. Shining Pearl, you and Prentice are going to swim for shore." "Why them?" said James. "Thomas and I can—" "Because they are closest to the water," said Teacher, "and because Fighting Prawn is most likely to listen to his daughter, and I need the rest of you," she nodded at James, Thomas, and little Scallop, "to create a diversion. But I warn you, this next part is a bit dangerous." "We're not afraid," said little Scallop. The rest nodded in agreement, although they were all, in fact, afraid. "All right, then," said Teacher. "Listen very carefully. In a moment I will make a loud warning sound. This will signal to the mermaids that an attack is coming. They will look back toward the beach. When they do, the three of you," she nodded to James, Thomas, and little Scallop, "must grab the canoe and pull it up on Mermaid Island as fast as you can. Drag it across until you're on the other side, out of sight. Then launch it into the water, but do not get into it. Instead, hide in the bushes." "Why shouldn't we get into the canoe?" said Thomas. "Because the mermaids would catch you. I want them to see the canoe and chase after it. When they find it, I want you to come out from the bushes, waving your arms and shouting, so they'll see you're still on Mermaid Island. Then they'll come back here after you. And while that's going on," she turned to Shining Pearl and Prentice, "swim back to the beach as fast as you can. Does everybody understand?" "What happens if the mermaids catch us while we're being a diversion?" said little Scallop. "You'll have the advantage, at least for a while," said Teacher. "They don't move well on the land. Mermaid Island is small, but if you stay away from the water, you should be able to avoid them until help comes." "If help comes," said James, thinking about being pursued around this small rocky bit of land by a group of angry, sharp-toothed mermaids. "It will come," said Shining Pearl. "We'll get help, I promise." James nodded, but he didn't look convinced. "All right, then," said Teacher. "Get ready." With a sudden movement, she raised up on her rock perch and made a terrifyingly loud shrieking sound, pointing toward the lagoon beach. Instantly the other mermaids whirled to look, clambering across the rocks toward the water. "Now," said Teacher, "the canoe!" James, Thomas, and little Scallop leaped to their feet, ran to the canoe, and grabbed it. In seconds they were dragging it up the rocks and across the little island. It was a few more seconds before one of the mermaids spotted them. She made a shrieking sound like the one Teacher had made. The other mermaids whirled to see the children disappearing over the top of the island with the canoe. At once the mermaids were in the water, splashing their huge, powerful tails as they shot around the island to intercept the children on the other side. From her perch, Teacher watched them go. She looked down at Shining Pearl and Prentice. "Go," she whispered. "Swim as fast as you can, and don't look back." A second later, Shining Pearl and Prentice plunged into the warm, murky lagoon water, swimming for the beach as hard as they could, each one fearing that at any moment the mad mermaids would see them and hunt them down. Chapter 13. Escape. Shining Pearl swam with all her strength. She was a graceful swimmer and a good deal faster than Prentice. Despite Teacher's instruction not to look back, she glanced behind her. She saw Prentice flailing in her wake, but she saw no mermaids coming. So far, Teacher's plan was working. She turned and swam some more. With each breath, she looked ahead. The lagoon beach, she realized, was farther than it had appeared to be. On and on she swam. She was starting to tire, her lungs aching, her muscles cramping. She turned back. Prentice, clearly exhausted, had fallen farther behind her. She glanced again back toward the island. Oh no! The mermaids had figured out the ruse. Several were up on the rocks, shrieking and pointing toward Shining Pearl and Prentice. A half-dozen powerful green tails splashed the water. The mermaids were coming. Shining Pearl, starting to panic, looked ahead. The beach, on an angle to her left, was probably too far away to reach in time. Directly ahead was a small rocky cove. Ordinarily, this was where the waterfall splashed into the lagoon after falling down the side of the steep cliff. They'd have to aim for that instead of the beach. "Prentice!" she gasped. He looked up, his face fearful and tired. Shining Pearl pointed toward the waterfall cove. "That way!" she shouted. He nodded and changed course. Shining Pearl looked behind him and saw the lagoon surface rippling with the fast-moving V-shaped trails of the oncoming mermaids. She waited until Prentice had caught up, then swam next to him. "Hurry!" she urged, but she could see he wasn't nearly fast enough. Neither was she. The ripples were closing fast. The shore was too far away. The mermaids were going to catch them. She let Prentice get ahead and fell directly behind him. She glanced back. The ripples were almost upon them. Shining Pearl drew her feet up, preparing to kick back hard the instant she felt a bite. Suddenly, she heard a splash. She let out an involuntary scream as something broke the surface next to her. She balled her fist and turned, ready to punch. Arm! The sight of the dolphin's familiar smiling snout filled her with relief. He was chittering rapidly, but Shining Pearl didn't understand him. Unlike Arm's old friends, Peter and Molly, Shining Pearl did not speak porpoise. She immediately understood, however, what Arm wanted her to do. She grabbed hold of his dorsal fin and held on tight as he surged forward, a half-second before the closest pursuing mermaid burst from the lagoon, her razor teeth snapping at the air where Shining Pearl had just been. Arm sped ahead, and Shining Pearl, hanging onto his fin with her left hand, reached out with her right to grab Prentice's arm. Now all three shot forward, Shining Pearl and Prentice hanging on literally for dear life. Arm was a very powerful swimmer, but the weight of the children slowed him greatly. He was barely able to keep ahead of the pursuing mermaids. He headed for the closest land, the waterfall cove. They reached it 5 seconds ahead of the mermaids, just enough time for Shining Pearl and Prentice to scramble from the water and onto the rocks at the base of the waterfall. Shining Pearl yelled her thanks to Arm, but the porpoise had spun and shot away, clearly not wanting to fall into the mermaid's clutches. For the moment, Shining Pearl and Prentice were safe, but only for the moment. The walls of the waterfall cove rose almost straight up from the lagoon on both sides. They couldn't get back to the lagoon beach without going back into the water, which was filled with hissing, snarling mermaids. Some of the mermaids were starting to climb up the rocks toward the children. Prentice was watching them anxiously. "What are we going to do?" he said. Shining Pearl looked around. There was only one way out. "We're going to have to climb the cliff," she said. Prentice looked at the towering vertical rock wall behind them. "But how?" he said. "We'll never get up that." "It's either that," said Shining Pearl, "or we wait for the mermaids to get us." Prentice looked at the cliff, the mermaids, and the cliff again. "All right then," he said. "Let's go." Chapter 14. Devil's Hole. For several minutes Ted had watched as the pirates made their way down from the mountain ridge. He was pretty sure now where they were going, a place the Mollusks called by a name that in English would be something like Devil's Hole. Shining Pearl had taken the boys to see Devil's Hole once. It was a lava-filled pit on a level place in the mountainside that belched steam and stinky sulphur fumes. Shining Pearl said that generations ago the lava spilled out and flowed down to the village, causing terrible destruction. Eventually the flow stopped, and the mollusks built a stone wall in hopes of diverting any future flow, but they kept a wary eye on the smoking, steaming hole on the hillside. Ted wondered why the pirates were heading toward Devil's Hole and why they had bought the keg. He was about to creep closer to spy on them when he heard somebody yell, "Help!" The yell came from the direction of the lagoon. Ted ran down the hill until he came to the cliff. He was not fond of heights, so he got down on hands and knees and crept forward until he could look over the edge of the steep cliff. He was shocked to see Shining Pearl and Prentice, who had somehow gotten off Mermaid Island halfway up the cliff's side, both looking quite terrified. They had good reason to be, Ted saw. Not only were they clinging to a rock wall that was nearly straight up and down, but in the lagoon directly beneath them were some very angry mermaids. "Up here!" Ted shouted. "We're stuck!" Prentice called back. "You've got to help us!" Ted saw the problem. Prentice and Shining Pearl had reached a smooth, vertical part of the cliff. They couldn't climb any higher. There was nothing to grab onto. They certainly couldn't go back down, and there was no way Ted could climb down to help them. He was dizzy just looking over the edge. "Hang on!" he shouted. He crawled away from the cliff's edge, stood up, got rid of the dizzies, and looked around frantically. He was surrounded by rock. No help there, but off to his left he spotted a place where an outcropping of the cliff jutted over the jungle, and a few tall trees poked their tops just above the cliff's edge. In those tree-tops, Ted hoped, were vines. Ted ran to the outcropping and again dropped to his hands and knees to approach the edge next to one of the trees. The tree did indeed have vines, and nice thick ones at that, but the nearest vine was still several feet from the cliff's edge. To reach it, Ted would have to lean far out from the cliff over empty air. He took a breath and closed his eyes, so he couldn't see the rocks at the base of the cliff at least 100 feet straight down. He waved his hand around, fighting the dizziness growing inside him. Finally, he caught a vine. He grabbed it and pulled, but the vine resisted him, clinging to the tree branch. He was very dizzy now. He was afraid he'd lose his balance and plunge to the rocks below. With a desperate heave, he jerked the vine. He heard the leaves rustle as the vine parted reluctantly from the branch, and then he fell backward onto solid ground. From here he could get more traction, and with effort he pulled a 20-foot length of vine from the tree. But 20 feet was not enough. Twice more Ted had to force himself to lean out over the cliff to get vines. The second one was so far away that Ted very nearly lost his balance. When he finally got that vine, he lay on the rocks for a full minute, waiting for his pounding heart to settle down. Then he rose and carefully tied the 3 vines together, using knots that the boys had been taught by the mollusks. He hoped the combined vines would be long enough. They would have to be. Ted coiled the vines and ran back to the top of the dry waterfall. He leaned over. It didn't seem so scary now after what he'd done to get the vines, and was relieved to see that Prentice and Shining Pearl were where he'd left them. "Hello!" he shouted down. They looked up, and Ted saw the exhaustion and fear on their faces. "I'm going to lower a vine!" he shouted. Prentice and Shining Pearl nodded. Ted made a noose on one end of the vine and draped it over a large boulder. He then wrapped a loop around his waist and tossed the other end of the vine over the cliff. He didn't dare get close to the edge to see what was happening, but he saw the vine grow taut, so he knew somebody had grabbed hold of it. He prayed that the vine was strong enough and that his knots would hold. He leaned back, using his weight to steady the vine. He felt somebody climbing, then resting, then climbing some more. It took several minutes. It seemed to Ted like an hour, but finally he saw a hand reach the top of the cliff, and then Shining Pearl's face, wet with sweat. He grabbed her and helped her scramble to safety. "Thank you," she gasped. She lay on the rock, panting, while Ted heaved the vine back over the edge. In a few minutes, Prentice, too, was safe. "Good work, Ted," Prentice said when he'd caught his breath. "I thought we were done for." "How did you get off Mermaid Island?" said Ted. "And what happened to the others?" Quickly, Prentice and Shining Pearl told Ted about their escape and about the blood tide. "We've got to get to my father," said Shining Pearl. "We need to explain about the sickness before the warriors attack the mermaids." "There's something else we need to tell him," said Ted. "The pirates are up to something." He told them about seeing Hook and his men on the mountainside nearby. "But why would they be going to Devil's Hole?" said Prentice. "And why are they taking the gunpowder?" added Ted. "Whatever Hook is planning," said Shining Pearl, "I suspect it's not good. Listen, we have to head toward Devil's Hole to get to my father anyway. Maybe on the way we can see what the pirates are up to." Moments later, they were heading up Waterfall Hill, keeping hidden from view by walking in the bed carved by the now dry stream. They'd gone 50 yards when they came to a huge mound of recently disturbed earth and rock, completely blocking the stream bed. "So that's what stopped the waterfall," said Prentice. "The earthquake must have done this." They climbed up onto the mound and found, on the other side, a large pond formed by the backed-up stream water. The overflow, unable to follow the stream's usual course, flowed out off to the side, creating a new stream that went down a different side of Waterfall Hill. "That water's going to the sea now," said Shining Pearl. "It can't reach the lagoon. That's what caused the blood tide." "If we could move this dirt," said Prentice, "the stream would go back into the lagoon." "Oh, right," said Ted, looking at the massive mound of dirt and huge rocks. "Go ahead and move this, would you please, Prentice?" "I'm not saying it would be easy," said Prentice. "Easy? How about impossible?" said Ted. "I suppose you're right," said Prentice. He turned to Shining Pearl. "We'd better get going then, if we're going to tell your father about the mermaids and the pirates." At those words, Shining Pearl, who'd been staring at the earth mound, snapped her head around. "But that's it," she said. "What's it?" said Prentice. Instead of answering, Shining Pearl turned to Ted and said, "Which way are the pirates?" Chapter 15. The Chief's Clever Plan. Fighting Prawn leaned on his spear, which he had stuck into the earth where the dirt of the jungle met the sand of the lagoon. He looked out toward Mermaid Island, and then shifted his eyes toward a distant curve of beach over a half-mile away, where some mermaids had gathered. They were next to the place where the steep cliff began. Past that, out of sight, was the cove formed by the now absent waterfall. Fighting Prawn had been watching the mermaids for a while, wondering what they were up to. He knew they were watching him, too. Mermaids had very good eyes. He looked back toward the jungle. His warriors were labouring to carry 12 large, heavy dugout canoes overland from the oceanside beach to the lagoon in preparation for the attack on Mermaid Island. Other mollusks were carrying coils of rope woven from vines and elephant grass. In fact, it seemed as if the whole village had come to the lagoon to watch the battle. When the canoes were in the shallow water by the beach, Fighting Prawn ordered the men to arrange them in 3 groups of 4 canoes each. "Now," said Fighting Prawn, Lash the canoes together, side by side." The men looked puzzled. This wasn't how they launched canoes. Fighting Prawn, raising his voice, said, "The mermaids are strong enough to flip a single canoe, but they can't flip 4 canoes if we lash them together, as we do when we are caught at sea in a storm." The men smiled at their chief's cleverness, but Fighting Prawn did not smile. He was troubled by the mermaids at the end of the lagoon. Something else troubled him as well. His eyes scanned the tribe, and he frowned. He called over his eldest son, Bold Abalone, and spoke to him softly. "I don't see Shining Pearl or Little Scallop," he said. "You sent them to the hut," reminded Bold Abalone. "I know that," said Fighting Prawn, "but I also know my daughters. They wouldn't stay in the village with this excitement going on." "Do you want me to look for them?" said Bold Abalone. Fighting Prawn looked at the canoes. His men had finished lashing them together into rafts. "No," he told Bold Abalone. "I need you here." He turned to his warriors and ordered them to ready the rafts. He grabbed his spear and climbed onto the first raft. As the men pushed it into the lagoon and began paddling, he turned his gaze toward Mermaid Island and the mermaids watching him from the end of the lagoon. He tried to concentrate his thoughts on the battle ahead, but he couldn't rid his mind of a lingering worry. Where were his daughters? Chapter 16. The Children Grow Weary. "What are we going to do?" said Little Scallop, her voice quavering with fear, her eyes on the hissing, snarling mermaids crawling toward them. "We've got to keep moving," said James, trying to keep the fear out of his own voice. "It's all we can do." "What happens when we're too tired to move?" asked Thomas. James had no answer for that. The mermaids were, in fact, getting closer. It had taken them only a few minutes to flip the decoy canoe and discover it was empty. They had soon spotted Little Scallop, James and Thomas hiding behind some rocks on Mermaid Island. Since then, the mermaids had been relentlessly pursuing the children around the island. The children's legs gave them a temporary advantage. They were good climbers, and they could move quickly, keeping boulders between themselves and their pursuers. The mermaids had to use their arms to move on the land, dragging their long tails behind them. They had trouble climbing, but they could still move surprisingly quickly when they wanted to. They were starting to figure out that they could spread out, giving the children fewer places to hide. And time was working for them. The children were growing weary. James had hoped that Teacher would protect them, but she was still on the high rock, surrounded by mermaids who now were clearly holding her prisoner. She could not help the children, and they could not run forever. James looked toward Waterfall Hill, but saw no sign of Ted, Prentice, or Little Scallop. He saw no help coming from anywhere. Meanwhile, the mermaids, baring their sharp teeth, were getting closer and closer. Chapter 17. There won't be nothing left. Ted led Shining Pearl and Prentice off Waterfall Hill into the jungle. There they joined a path heading down the steep mountainside toward Devil's Hole. They moved as quietly as they could, not wanting the pirates to hear them coming. In a few minutes they heard men's voices ahead. Ted raised his hand, and they all stopped to listen. The first words they could make out were in the snarling voice of Captain Hook. "That's the spirit, men," he said. "There won't be nothing left of them savages by the time we're through." The children looked at each other in horror. Shining Pearl moved close to the two boys and whispered, "Through with what? What are they doing?" "Let's find out," whispered Prentice. The three children stepped off the path and crept through the thick jungle toward the pirates. They stopped on a ledge above Devil's Hole. The air reeked of sulphur. Carefully parting the curtain of green plants, the children peered down at the scene below. Almost directly underneath was Devil's Hole, which belched steam and glowed red from the bubbling lava inside. Just beyond was the stone wall built by the mollusks to protect their village. On the slope beyond the wall stood Hook, Smee, and the rest of the pirates. The gunpowder keg stood nearby on a level spot of ground. 2 of the pirates, using tree limbs as crude shovels, were digging a hole at the base of the wall. The men stopped for a moment to wipe the sweat from their foreheads. "Captain," said one, "is this deep enough?" Hook stepped forward, bent, and peered into the hole with his glittering black eyes. He stood back up, raised his left arm, the twisted question mark of a hook glinting in the sun, and carefully scratched his cheek with its sharpened point. "A bit deeper," he said. "We have only the one keg. We'd best be sure we blow a nice big hole in the wall." The men looked unhappy, but were not about to question Captain Hook. They resumed digging. "Captain," said Smee. "What is it, Smee?" said Hook. "How are you planning to light the powder when the time comes? We ain't got no fire up here." Hook smiled. He had already thought about this problem, yet more proof of his brilliance. "We have plenty of fire, Smee," he said. "We do," said Smee. "We do," said Hook. "Right down that hole there." He pointed his hook hand toward the steaming lava pit. "When I give the signal, you'll stick the end of a tree branch into that lava there, and it'll burst right into flames. Then you'll drop the burning branch into the hole with the powder. She'll blow quite nicely." Smee frowned, thinking. After a few moments he said, "Captain." "What, Smee?" "When you say I'm going to light the powder, do you mean I'm going to light the powder?" "Yes," said Hook. "I'd do it myself, of course, but I need to supervise the sealing of the savage's boat. So you'll blow the powder, then come down to join us, taking care to avoid the lava flow." Smee's frown deepened. "But, Captain," he said, "ain't it a bit dangerous? Being right here when the powder blows, I mean, and the lava coming down the mountain." "Not at all, Smee," said Hook. "You'll have several, moments to get away. I'm sure it's perfectly safe, which is why I've chosen you as first mate for the honour." Smee looked very doubtful about this honour, but Hook turned away to inspect the digger's progress with the hole. "Another foot, men," he said. "Then we'll put the keg inside and get ready to blow this wall." He looked down at Mollusk village, at the foot of the ravine leading from Devil's Hole down the mountainside. "We'll be saying goodbye to this cursed island," he said, "and them savages will be saying goodbye to their village." On the ledge above Devil's Hole, Shining Pearl, Prentice, and Ted crawled back into the jungle and up the mountainside out of earshot from the pirates. "They're going to blow out the wall," said Ted. "And destroy the village with lava," said Prentice. "Just to steal a boat," said Shining Pearl bitterly. "I've got to tell Father now." "It may be a little late for that," said Ted. "What do you mean?" said Shining Pearl. "Look," said Ted, pointing to an open space between 2 trees through which the lagoon could be seen far below. Shining Pearl and Prentice looked and gasped when they saw what Ted had seen. A large raft made of canoes lashed together had pushed off from the shore. Dozens of warriors were aboard, paddling hard toward Mermaid Island. At the front of the raft stood a tall figure holding a spear. Shining Pearl couldn't make out his face at this distance, but there was no doubt in her mind who it was. Fighting Prawn had launched the attack. Chapter 18. The Water Turns White. The bulky canoe raft moved slowly across the lagoon, paddled by 24 sweating warriors. Another dozen stood ready with spears, their eyes on the murky water, watching for a mermaid attack. At the front of the raft stood Fighting Prawn, his hand on his spear, his gaze aimed straight ahead at Mermaid Island. He could see a lot of activity. There were mermaids moving along the island's rocky shore, watching the raft. Others were crawling around on the higher part of the island, as if chasing something, although Fighting Prawn could not see what. As the raft drew closer, the mermaids on the shore became more agitated, their long green tails flicking back and forth, sparkling in the sunlight. Then one of them made a strange noise, loud and hoarse. Suddenly, with movements so quick that Fighting Prawn could barely follow them, they dove into the lagoon. For a few moments the water churned white, whipped by a dozen or more powerful tails. Then there was nothing. Fighting Prawn's eyes scanned the lagoon, but the water was flat, not a ripple, not a bubble. Fighting Prawn turned to his men. "Be ready," he said. "Paddlers, don't let them pull you in." The men nodded. Fighting Prawn raised his face toward the sky and, as mollusks had always done when going into battle, let out a war cry. The other men echoed him, their cry floating across the lagoon and echoing off the stark rock face of Waterfall Hill. It was an impressive sound, one that usually struck fear into the hearts of the enemy. But this enemy could not hear them. This enemy was invisible, silent. There was no way to know when or how they would attack. Fighting Prawn glanced back. The raft had seemed big enough when they had launched it. It didn't seem so big now, away from the safety of land. He turned forward again, not wanting his men to see even a hint of concern on his face. He looked again at the water. He saw nothing. He gripped his spear tighter. The attack was coming. But when? And from where? Chapter 19. Rolling Boulders. James crouched behind a rock, breathing hard, grateful for a moment's rest. But then he heard it again, the sound he'd learned to fear, the sound of mermaids hissing and of their long tails dragging across the rocks, getting closer. James, little Scallop and Thomas had decided to separate, hoping to make it harder for the mermaids to trap them. The children had spread out, each taking a different route, moving from rock to rock, heading for what little higher ground there was on the tiny island. James caught a few glimpses of little Scallop, but he'd lost sight of Thomas. He had little time to look around. Each time he stopped, the mermaids got closer. He heard them now, just on the other side of his rock. He jumped up and ran farther up the hill. He was near the crest now. Beyond that, there was no higher ground to escape to. He ducked behind another boulder, knowing it would not protect him for long. He leaned against it, growing weary. The boulder moved. He leaned on it harder, and this time it rocked considerably forward, then back. He peered around the side. 4 mermaids were coming up the hill. The one in front caught sight of him, her eyes wild with fury. She hissed and bared her sharp teeth. She was only about 20 feet away. James shifted a few feet to his left to take a better angle. He leaned hard against the boulder, tipping it forward. He let it rock back, then leaned on it again, then let it rock back. The mermaids were getting close. With a grunt, James heaved himself into the boulder again, rocking it still farther forward, but not quite enough. He jumped back as the boulder came toward him. He heard hisses from the other side. As the boulder rocked forward, he hurled himself at it, putting all of his weight into it this time. The boulder almost stopped, but then broke free and rolled forward, straight toward the mermaid. She let out a horrifying screech, flipped herself backward down the hill and sideways, just barely avoiding the boulder as it tumbled past her and the other mermaids, rolling all the way down and splashing into the lagoon. "Well done, James!" James turned and saw Thomas running toward him, followed by little Scallop. They too had been driven to the top of the hill, both followed closely by packs of mermaids. The 3 children quickly found other suitable boulders and, working together, were able to roll them down the hill in various directions, forcing their pursuers to retreat. But each time, after the boulders passed, the mermaids resumed dragging themselves upward toward their prey. And as the children used up the loose boulders, they found fewer and fewer that they could budge. With each passing minute, the mermaids were getting closer. And then the children heard an awful sound, hissing from behind them. They turned and saw more mermaids cresting the hill, coming at them from the other side of the island. Boulders would do no good against these pursuers. They were uphill from the children. James, Thomas, and little Scallop whirled back around and saw that the mermaids had now spread out along the hillside, dragging themselves steadily closer. The children had no way to get down on this side, and moving farther up the hill would only bring them closer to the other group of mermaids. They were trapped. Chapter 20. It Might Hold a Pig. Prentice, Ted, and Shining Pearl were running out of time. Below them, through the jungle plants, they could see that the pirates were almost finished digging the hole for the gunpowder keg. If the children didn't stop them, the pirates would soon blow up the wall, release the lava, and destroy the Mollusk village. But how could 3 children stop a band of pirates? Prentice looked around the jungle hillside, trying to come up with a plan. He wished Peter were here. Peter always knew what to do. As he thought of Peter, something caught his eye. 2 things, actually. A mango tree about 20 yards away, and beneath it, a patch of brown leaves on the jungle floor. "That's it," he whispered. "What is?" said Ted. Prentice pointed to the brown leaves and whispered to Shining Pearl, "That's a trap, right?" She nodded and said, "The hunters use it to catch wild pigs. The pigs come to eat the mangoes, and they fall in. There's a hole under the leaves about 6 feet deep." "Maybe we can use it to catch some pirates," said Prentice. "A 6-foot hole might hold a pig," said Ted, "but it won't hold a pirate." "No, but it'll slow 'em down," said Prentice. "Maybe long enough for the 2 of us to grab that powder keg," said Shining Pearl. "Us?" said Ted. "Me?" Shining Pearl nodded. "It's the key to my plan." "Then I'm not sure I like your plan," Ted said. "You 2 hide here," said Prentice. "I'll climb the mango tree and get Hook's attention the way Peter does." When Peter was on the island, he greatly enjoyed flying over the pirate camp and bombarding Hook with juicy mangoes. This was yet another reason why Hook absolutely hated the flying boy. "You're going to throw mangoes at Hook?" said Ted. "Yes," said Prentice. "I'm good at throwing." "You'll be good and dead when the pirates come after you," said Ted. Prentice waved his hand. "They won't catch me," he said. "But while they're chasing me, you 2 will get the powder keg. Remember, we need it up on Waterfall Hill. I'll catch up to you when I get away from the pirates." "If you get away," said Ted. "I'll be fine," said Prentice. "Just you take care of—" "The gunpowder," said Shining Pearl. "Don't worry, we will." Ted looked doubtful, but he didn't have a better idea. Leaving them, Prentice crept quietly through the jungle toward the mango tree, steering clear of the pig trap. Shining Pearl led Ted in the other direction, to a bush as close as she dared get to the pirates. She peered through the branches and saw that the pirates had finished digging the hole. "All right, men," said Hook. "Bring that keg here, and—" Splat! A large, overripe mango exploded at Hook's feet, spattering his legs with sticky pulp. Hook looked down at it for a moment, then looked up, his face darkening with rage. His glittering dark eyes scanned the jungle treetops. Splat! A second mango burst on Hook's tattered pants. He roared in fury. It was that cursed flying boy again. He was sure of it. "Boy!" he shouted, slipping the flintlock pistol from his waist, pulling back its hammer and aiming it at the treetops. When Ted saw the pistol, his face went white. Hook's pistol was usually just for show, because he had nothing to load it with. But now he had gunpowder, a whole keg of it. His pistol could actually shoot. Ted was about to shout a warning to Prentice when a third mango hurtled through the air and hit Hook smack in the face, causing him to flinch just as he pulled the trigger. The flintlock discharged with a bang, but was now aimed not at the trees, but at the broad backside of First Mate Smee, who yelped and leaped into the air higher than he had ever leaped before. Fortunately, Hook had no bullets for his gun, and thus had packed it with coral fragments. So Smee was not seriously wounded, but he was stung. He danced around, yipping as though his pants were on fire. Meanwhile, Hook was wiping the mango from his furious face, reloading his pistol and bellowing orders to his men.
"After him!"
he shouted, pointing uphill toward the jungle.
"Get that cursed flying mango-flinging boy!"
The pirates charged up the hill, even Smee, who brought up the rear, while holding his own with both hands. The moment the pirates entered the jungle, Shining Pearl and Ted came out from behind the bush and ran to the gunpowder keg. It was heavier than it looked, so they put it on its side and, working together, began rolling it across the mountainside in the direction of Waterfall Hill. Back in the tree, Prentice had 3 more mangoes at his disposal. He took careful aim at the approaching pirates and managed to hit Hook with 2 of the 3. In doing so, Prentice also revealed his location.
"He's in that tree!"
Hook bellowed, waving his pistol.
"Hard to starboard, men!"
The pirates swung to their right and headed at a full run straight for the tree. Their path took them directly over the patch of brown leaves. The first man went down like a stone. The others, unable to stop in time, fell right in after him, one atop one another, with Hook and Smee last. As the pirates roared in pain and surprise, Prentice hung from a branch, dropped lightly to the jungle floor, and took off at a dead run. Meanwhile, Hook was fighting his way out of the pig trap, using his hook to stab the ground and haul himself up while climbing on his men as though they were rungs on a human ladder. As he sprawled out onto the jungle floor, he caught a glimpse of a boy escaping into the distance, on foot. Hook roared in rage as he realized that it wasn't the flying boy. He'd been tricked. He was about to order his men to pursue the boy when he suddenly realized why he'd been tricked.
"The powder!"
he roared, kicking at his men as they scrambled from the pit.
"Get back to the powder!"
The pirates hurried back to Devil's Hole. The keg was gone. Hook whirled around looking for the thieves.
"There!"
he shouted, pointing across the mountainside at 2 small figures in the distance, rolling the keg. As he watched, a 3rd child joined them, the boy who had thrown the mangoes.
"After them!"
he screamed. The pirates took off running toward the distant figures. Hook expected the children to head down toward the sea, but instead, as they reached the rocky ridge leading up to Waterfall Hill, they began to roll it up the hillside. Hook smiled at their foolishness. Once they were up that hill, there was nowhere for them to go.
"Hurry, men!"
he shouted.
"We've got them now!"
Chapter 21. The battle raged. The attack on the canoe raft came from all sides at once. Fighting Prawn was lucky. He'd decided to crouch in the prow of his canoe so he could get a better view into the water. Just as he bent his knees, a mermaid burst straight up out of the lagoon, her razor-sharp teeth snapping the air where his head had been. She grabbed at Fighting Prawn as she fell, trying to pull him with her into the water. He lunged backward, avoiding her, but knocking over another warrior as he fell back into the canoe. Struggling back up, he heard sounds of fighting everywhere, the hissing of mermaids and shouts of rage and pain from his men. The mermaids were attacking from all sides, 4 or 5 of them at once, grabbing the paddles, sometimes using their teeth and astonishingly powerful jaws to snap them in 2. The men tried to fight back with their spears, but the mermaids yanked and pulled at the raft, using their powerful tails to toss and turn it so that the warriors could not keep their balance. One of the warriors thrust his spear at a mermaid, who dodged sideways and grabbed the shaft, almost dragging the warrior into the water before he was forced to let go. Another warrior, trying to stand so he could use his spear, tumbled into the lagoon. 2 mermaids lunged for him, but he was saved by 2 warriors who pulled him back onto the raft while the others drove the attackers back by smacking them with their paddles. Meanwhile, no one was rowing. As the battle raged, Fighting Prawn noticed that the mermaids on the right-hand side of the raft were pushing it, while the mermaids on the other sides were not. Suddenly he realized that they had a plan. They were moving the raft away from Mermaid Island and toward the rocks at the base of Waterfall Hill, about 50 yards to his left. They were picking up speed. In a few minutes the raft would wreck against those rocks. When it did, Fighting Prawn and his warriors would spill into the water, where their spears and their courage would be no match for the mermaids and their needle-like teeth. Chapter 22. Bowling for Pirates. Shining Pearl, Ted and Prentice struggled to roll the powder keg up the steep and rocky slope of Waterfall Hill. It was slow going. The keg was heavier than it looked. Shining Pearl glanced back over her shoulder at the pursuing pirates. "We have to go faster," she panted. "They're getting closer." Prentice and Ted looked back and saw that the pirates, with Hook urging them on, were indeed much nearer than before. The 3 children turned and pushed the keg even harder, but each time they looked back, they saw the same troubling sight. The pirates were gaining. The children were about 50 yards from the earth dam that had blocked the stream near the top of Waterfall Hill. It might as well have been a mile. They weren't going to outrun the pirates. "They're going to catch us," panted Ted. Prentice looked around. To the left was a rock outcropping, and next to it swayed the green tops of some tall palm trees rising up from the jungle below. "Keep going," Prentice said. "I'll slow them down." "But how—" began Shining Pearl. "I'm going bowling," Prentice called back as he ran toward the outcropping. "Has he lost his mind?" said Ted. "I think so," said Shining Pearl. She and Ted continued to struggle with the keg. Meanwhile, Prentice ran to the edge of the outcropping and dropped on his belly. He reached out to the top of the closest palm tree where he'd spotted a big bunch of coconuts hanging. He was able to snag one and, pulling with all his strength, yank it loose from the tree. Then he snagged another and another until he'd collected 6 big coconuts in all. Cradling them in his arms, he ran back to the slope. The pirates were very close now, but fortunately for Prentice, they were on a steep part of the hill where footing was slippery. The pirate in front was a stocky man with striped pants. Prentice hefted his biggest coconut in his right hand, drew his arm back, and took aim. Ted and Shining Pearl, still struggling with the keg, heard angry shouts erupt behind them. Ted started to turn. "Don't look back!" snapped Shining Pearl. "Keep pushing!" They were getting near the pond now. They passed close by a small pool of bubbling lava. Shining Pearl took note of it, her mind racing ahead, forming a plan. She looked ahead and saw the massive earth dam. "We're almost there," she said. "Thank goodness," gasped Ted. "I can't push this much farther." With one last rush of effort, they got the keg up to the mound of dirt and rocks. Behind it lay the new pond, filled by the stream of spring water that normally flowed down Waterfall Hill. The pond had grown quite large. Water was spilling out of its sides, running over into the jungle. The children set the keg on its end. Shining Pearl dropped to her knees and began digging into the dam with her bare hands, throwing rocks and dirt to the side, where Ted stood, gasping for air and wiping sweat from his brow. "No time to rest," said Shining Pearl. "Quick, find a dry stick, a big one. Stick it into the lava pool back there. When it catches fire, bring it back, and hurry." Ted was off running, looking for a stick. Shining Pearl resumed digging. From down the hill she heard shouting, louder now, but she didn't want to turn around to see how close the pirates were. Prentice's first try at coconut bowling had worked quite well. The stocky pirate, scrambling to avoid the coconut hurtling down the hill toward him, had slipped and fallen backward, knocking over several pirates behind him. They had slid down, yelping, to the very feet of Hook, almost toppling him over as well. Prentice had missed with his second coconut, but with the third he caught a tall, skinny pirate on the shin, causing the pirate to lose his balance and fall. The fourth coconut had missed, but the fifth caught one of the pirates square in the belly, sending him rolling down the hill a good 10 yards. So, with 5 coconuts gone, only one pirate, Hook, was still standing. He was still coming up the hill with a look of fury on his face. Prentice took careful aim. He drew his arm back, setting his eyes on a spot 10 feet in front of the captain and a bit to the right. He flung the coconut hard, putting some spin on it as he let it go. It flew down the hillside, bouncing once, twice. It looked as though it would miss Hook. The pirate captain was sure it would miss him. He started to smile, but then, on the third bounce, the spin did its work, and the coconut darted left, right at Hook's ankles. He tried to avoid it, but in doing so lost his balance. With a roar of rage, he fell. Prentice allowed himself a smile. He knocked them all down. But he was also out of coconuts, and the pirates were soon back on their feet and coming up the hill, angrier than ever. Prentice glanced up the hill. Ted was stumbling toward the earthen dam, carrying a flaming stick. Shining Pearl was at the base of the dam. The pirates were getting closer. There was no time to collect more coconuts. Prentice took off up the hill with Hook and his men right behind. Ted trotted up with the burning stick just as Shining Pearl finished digging a hole for the keg in the side of the earth dam. She grabbed a rock and banged it against the cork in the side of the keg to loosen it, then pulled out the cork. "Help me put it in the hole," she said to Ted. He stuck the burning stick into the dirt, and the two of them wrestled the keg uphill into the hole Shining Pearl had dug. As they moved the keg, powder spilled from the hole, leaving a line of powder in the dirt running up to the keg. "Hurry up!" It was Prentice, running up the hill as fast as he could. The pirates were only a dozen yards behind him. There was no more time. "Light it," she said to Ted. He grabbed the stick and touched it to the line of powder just as Prentice reached them. A coil of black, sparking smoke puffed and swirled and began climbing toward the keg. "What now?" yelled Ted. Prentice and Shining Pearl shouted the answer together. "Run!" Chapter 23. Nowhere to Run. As the pirates neared the earthen dam, Hook saw the children running away from it without the keg. Then he saw the black smoke. He knew right away what it meant.
They lit the powder!
He bellowed.
Run!
The question was, where to run? Waterfall Hill was a steep, rocky slope, offering no shelter. On one side, just beyond the huge pond, was a steep drop into the jungle. On the other side was a cliff dropping down to the lagoon. The children were running toward the cliff. For a moment Hook found himself amused by their poor choice. Then, looking around, he realized it was the only choice.
"Follow me!"
He started running toward the cliff, followed by his men. They were too late. From behind them came a whoomph. It was followed, a fraction of a second later, by a loud explosion. A huge glob of mud splattered against Hook's back, knocking him down. The other pirates were also flattened. That was a good thing, because the mud was followed by rocks flying through the air fast enough to take off someone's head. Hook and his men, belly down on the rocky slope, covered their heads as dirt, rocks, and mud rained all around them. After a few seconds, it stopped. The pirates, happy to be alive, started to get up. Then they heard a roaring, rushing sound, the sound of water. They looked up, and there it was. The pond had become a wall of muddy water, the height of a man, gushing down the hill straight at them. The pirates started to run from it, but managed only a few steps before... Whoosh! The huge wave caught the men and swept them off their feet. They tumbled like driftwood scraps, upside down and sideways, arms and legs everywhere. Hook somehow managed to get his head up, and with all his strength tried to get his feet down, so he could stop himself from being carried by the raging current. His toes touched rock. for a moment. Then he felt the ground disappear beneath him. Soon he felt himself falling. He had gone off the cliff. Around him, Hook heard his men screaming. He saw the cliff wall only a few feet away, a blur as he shot past it, falling faster and faster. He looked down and caught a glimpse of the dark lagoon, jagged boulders, and other falling bodies. To his horror, he saw that directly below him was a cluster of canoes full of shouting men. As he hurtled toward it, Hook had barely enough time to close his eyes and shout, "Look out below!" Chapter 24. Falling Water. Fighting Prawn, busy battling the mermaids attacking the canoe raft, didn't see the bodies falling. When he heard 3 loud splashes, his first thought was, more mermaids. Then he saw 3 heads pop to the surface, 2 boys and... Shining Pearl? Before Fighting Prawn had time to recover from the shock of seeing his daughter in the lagoon, a cascade of water, along with rocks and globs of mud, began to splash into the lagoon all around the raft. Fighting Prawn looked up and saw that there was more, much more, coming down from Waterfall Hill. With a shout, he dropped his spear, kicked a hissing mermaid out of the way, and dove into the lagoon to save his daughter. Meanwhile, his warriors, seeing that a huge body of water and debris was about to land on them, abandoned their fight with the mermaids and grabbed their paddles, hoping to get away. From overhead, they heard the shouts of the falling Hook, who appeared to be heading straight for the raft. Several warriors dropped their paddles and dove overboard. And then several things happened nearly at once. A gigantic mass of mud and water landed in the lagoon with a thunderous roar, sending up a huge wave that flung the mermaids every which way and lifted the canoe raft like a cork, forcing it rocking and spinning away from the cliff at astonishing speed. This was very fortunate for Hook, who, a half-second later, plummeted into the lagoon exactly where the raft had been. The raft, carried by the surging wave, was already halfway across the lagoon and still moving fast. Meanwhile, Fighting Prawn, a very strong swimmer, had somehow managed to grab hold of all 3 children and pull them under the water. They panicked and struggled to escape, but Fighting Prawn held firm and pulled them deeper, which is what kept them safe from the largest mass of mud and water as it crashed into the lagoon overhead. Finally, he brought them to the surface. They gasped for air as the current carried them toward Mermaid Island. Meanwhile, another thing was happening, less obvious to the human eye. The water spilling over Waterfall Hill was fresh water, millions of gallons of it. As it poured into the lagoon, it began to flush out the stagnant water that had caused the blood tide. Almost immediately, the mermaids in the lagoon began to feel the effects of this change. It was like a drowning person suddenly getting big gulps of fresh air. The mermaids felt much better. The strange anger that had gripped them melted away. They felt happy again. They swam, smiling, into the stream of water spilling from Waterfall Hill. They had no interest in fighting the mollusks or anybody else. They couldn't even remember why they had wanted to. Unfortunately, not all of the mermaids were in the lagoon. Some of them were on Mermaid Island. They had not felt the fresh water, and the anger still gripped them. And with every second, as they dragged themselves hissing with fury across the rocky ground, they were getting closer to James, Thomas, and little Scallop. Chapter 25. The Rising Wave. When they heard the explosion on Waterfall Hill, James, little Scallop, and Thomas were in bad trouble. They were surrounded, dodging from rock to rock, staying just ahead of the mermaids. But the hissing, snarling mermaids kept getting closer and closer. Soon there would be nowhere for the children to run. The chase stopped briefly when a loud boom echoed across the lagoon. Everyone, children and mermaids alike, looked to see what had caused it. But after a few seconds, the mermaids were coming again. As he avoided them, James kept glancing at Waterfall Hill. What he saw amazed him. First, 3 small figures appeared at the edge of the cliff. James recognized them as Ted, Prentice, and Shining Pearl. They stood there for a moment, and then, to James's shock, they had leaped off the cliff. A moment later, James saw why. A massive wall of water roared down the mountain. James saw men caught in the rushing water. Pirates, he realized. The surge swept them all, screaming, over the cliff. The mass of water hit the lagoon with a sound of thunder. Once again the mermaids paused to look. What they and James saw was terrifying. Heading right toward them was a huge wave. James could see that it was higher than where he stood at the top of Mermaid Island. The entire island would be under water. "Run!" he shouted, racing toward little Scallop and Thomas and grabbing their hands. The 3 of them sprinted past 2 mermaids, both staring, hypnotized, at the gigantic, oncoming wall of water. James led Thomas and Shining Pearl past them, down the hill, in the direction of the wave. "Why are we going this way?" said Thomas. "I have an idea," said James. "I hope it works," he thought. As they neared the bottom, they saw Teacher. Her back was to them. 2 mermaids guarded her, but they too were distracted by the sight of the huge wave. "Hello!" James shouted. The mermaids turned to look at him. "What are you doing?" said little Scallop. The mermaids were now fully facing the children, turned away from the towering wave rushing toward the island. James tried to figure out how long it would take to reach them. The guard mermaids started to drag themselves toward the children. James, still holding the other children's hands, started running toward the hissing mermaids. "You're mad," little Scallop said, pulling back. "You've got to trust me," James said. "Our only hope is to reach Teacher." Little Scallop and Thomas, now understanding the plan, ran forward with James. Teacher also understood and began to drag herself toward them. They all came together, children, guard mermaids, and Teacher, at exactly the moment that the wave, with the sound of 100 roaring locomotives, crashed onto the island. "Teacher!" shouted James, but his voice was lost in the thunderous sound. Hanging on to little Scallop and Thomas, he lunged toward the mermaid, who wrapped her arms around the 3 children as the water crashed over them. In the next instant, the world turned upside down and sideways as the children and Teacher were whirled around inside the churning water, which, luckily, swept them away from the rocky island into deeper water. Still, James, Thomas, and Shining Pearl thought their lungs would burst as the water held them under for what seemed like forever. But Teacher gripped them tightly and, using her powerful tail, worked her way upward. Finally, they reached the surface, where James, Thomas, and little Scallop took big gulps of air. James looked back. The wave had passed over Mermaid Island and then receded, leaving its rocks exposed once again. But very near the top of the island, James spied something else. 3 children he knew well, and standing with them, hugging Shining Pearl, was Fighting Prawn. They were soaking wet, but appeared unhurt. "Father!" shouted little Scallop, waving her arm. Fighting Prawn and Shining Pearl waved back, as did Ted and Prentice. In a few moments, Teacher had towed James, Thomas, and little Scallop back to Mermaid Island. Safe, thought James as they reached the shore. He was about to thank Teacher for saving them, but before he could, she arched her back and dove into the now fresh waters of the lagoon. Chapter 26. Blub, blub, blub. Hook, having been swept off the cliff, was deep under water, and he couldn't swim. There had never been any reason for him to. He had always had a ship beneath him, but now he was trying desperately to learn. He flailed his arms and legs, only to find himself sinking deeper into the murky depths of the lagoon. He tried to cry for help, but made only a noise that sounded like blub, as bubbles of precious air escaped from his mouth. He saw somebody swimming his way. He reached out, thinking it was one of his men, but he recoiled in fear when he realized it was a mermaid. She had heard what Hook's men had not. She swam toward him, her grinning mouth showing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Hook panicked, trying frantically to swim away, but he only made himself sink faster. "Blub!" he shouted, letting more air escape his lungs. The mermaid swam straight at him. Hook reached for his sword, but in the water his arms moved too slowly, so he raised his fists, prepared to box her. But the mermaid was a magnificent swimmer, almost as fluid as the water itself. At the last second she darted around Hook. He spun to face her, but she wasn't there, only streaks of tiny bubbles forming circles around him, like the rings of Saturn. Suddenly Hook felt hands slip under his arms from behind. Hook was too weak to struggle now. He was blacking out from lack of air. "She's going to squeeze all the air out of me," he thought. But instead, she gently wrapped her arms around him. Suddenly Hook felt himself rapidly being lifted up, toward the surface. The water grew brighter. The surface was a glowing mirror. Hook felt the thrusts of her powerful tail pushing them higher and higher. His face broke through, and he gulped for air. Now the mermaid was towing him toward shore. "She's rescuing me." Hook looked around. It was the same all over the lagoon, smiling mermaids pulling mollusk warriors and pirates to shore or to the mollusk's overturned raft. In a minute, Hook felt sand beneath his feet. He scrambled, getting his legs under him. Land had never felt so good. His rescuer lingered a few feet from shore, apparently waiting to make sure he made it to the beach safely. Hook turned to her, and as their eyes met, he spoke 2 words that he had never, not once, uttered or even thought of uttering. 2 words that to him sounded almost like a foreign language, but they were the 2 most honest words he'd ever spoken. "Thank you," he said. The mermaid's smile grew wider, and she swam away. Chapter 27. The Best Day. By the next day, the lagoon no longer held any tinge of red. It was back to its usual shimmering, sparkling blue. The waterfall tumbled into the lagoon from Waterfall Hill, making a pleasant splashing sound. Teacher and the other mermaids were sunning on the rocks off Mermaid Island, having taken a long swim. Gathered on the beach were little Scallop and the boys, who had been led there by Fighting Prawn. For a few moments everybody simply enjoyed the scene, although James shivered a little when he thought about fleeing from hissing, needle-toothed mermaids on the now peaceful little island. Finally, Fighting Prawn turned to the children and broke the silence. "You have done well," he said. "You brought peace to the island. You saved the mermaids. We would have hurt them, killed them perhaps, if you hadn't brought back the waterfall, which drove the blood tide away." "Do the mermaids remember attacking us?" asked Shining Pearl. "I doubt that they remember much, if anything, of their meanness," said Fighting Prawn. "When the fresh water returned, they quickly became themselves again, and saved many of us, pirates and mollusks alike. But you, children, were the ones who saved them. So it is you that the tribe wishes to thank." Fighting Prawn raised his hand. As he did, the entire mollusk clan emerged from the jungle surrounding the lagoon. One of the women walked up to Fighting Prawn and handed him 6 necklaces, from each of which hung a perfect pink sand dollar. James blushed. "We didn't exactly know what we were doing," he said. "Perhaps not," said Fighting Prawn, "but what you did was right, and it took great courage. You saved the mermaids, and you surely saved some of us. You saved our village from those foolish pirates. You saved the lagoon. In truth, you saved our island." He turned to Shining Pearl and little Scallop. "And my daughters have brought honor to our family." He knelt and hugged the 2 girls, who both beamed with pride. Then Fighting Prawn stood and said, "I'm very proud of all of you. By your actions yesterday,
You have earned yourselves the title of warrior."
Shining Pearl's face lit with excitement.
"Warrior? Really?" Fighting Prawn said, "You and your friends will be honorary warriors."
"Oh, honorary," said Shining Pearl. Ted said excitedly, "I've never been a warrior before."
Thomas said,
"Does that mean we get to wear face paint?"
Fighting Prawn chuckled. "We'll see," he said.
Then he beckoned to the other mollusks, who gathered in a semicircle around the children. They watched with big smiles as Fighting Prawn put the necklaces one by one over the children's heads. Then, in a booming voice, the chief said,
"For conquering the blood tide and maintaining peace on our island, I declare that these brave children are honorary warriors of the Mollusk tribe."
The mollusks erupted in a cheer that echoed across the lagoon. Raising their arms, they chanted a special chant in celebration of the new warriors. From the island, the mermaids were waving. James looked around, taking it all in. The hot sun, the waving mermaids, the sparkling waterfall pouring from Waterfall Hill into the pristine lagoon, the necklace around his neck, his friends by his side, everyone smiling. James smiled, and he looked at Shining Pearl, who was smiling too. They were both thinking the same thing. This is the best day of my life. We hope you've enjoyed our presentation of Blood Tide by Dave Barry and Ridley Pearson. Copyright 2008 by Dave Barry and Page One Incorporated. Read by Jim Dale. Directed by Kathleen Hale. Performance copyright 2008 by Brilliance Audio. Published by arrangement with Disney Editions. All rights reserved. For further information concerning this program or other Brilliance Audio titles, please call the following toll-free number, 1-800-222-3225, or visit our website at www.brillianceaudio.com. No part of this recording may be played for an audience or reproduced in any form. It may not be streamed, downloaded, broadcast, or copied without written permission. Address all enquiries to Brilliance Audio, P.O. Box 887, Grand Haven, Michigan 49417.